Listen closely. What you are about to witness is not merely a story of history recorded in dusty textbooks. This is the chronicle of human beings whose lives were reduced to transactions, whose names were erased, whose futures were purchased and sold like commodities in a marketplace of unspeakable cruelty. We journey back to a time when the greatest contradiction of human civilization reached its apex, when freedom itself became the rarest currency. Our narrative begins not with violence, but with life. In the 1780s, across the coasts of West Africa and the interior regions of what would become Angola and Congo, there existed thriving communities. These were not abstract historical concepts. They were places where children played in red soil under the blazing sun, where the scent of spices mixed with ocean air in bustling markets, where elders sat beneath ancient trees sharing wisdom that had been passed down for generations, where songs carried the stories of ancestors and hopes for descendants yet to be born. The climate was unforgiving, yet familiar to those who lived within it. Humidity clung to the skin like a second layer, and the rainy seasons transformed landscapes into emerald paradises. The architecture told stories of ingenuity, mud brick homes with thatched roofs, built to withstand both the heat and the torrential downpours. Market squares buzzed with activity. Children's laughter echoed through narrow pathways. Families gathered for evening meals around fires, sharing what little or much they had harvested or traded. In a village not far from the coast, there lived a man named Kofi. He was 53 years old, a respected elder in his community, a master craftsman who worked leather and created tools that were sought after in surrounding regions. His hands bore the marks of a lifetime of honest labor. His eyes held the wisdom that comes from half a century of witnessing seasons change, children grow, and traditions endure. Kofi had 3 children. His eldest son was preparing to take his father's trade. His daughter was betrothed to a merchant from a neighboring village. His youngest was only 7, still learning the ways of his people, still believing that the world operated according to the natural laws that had sustained his family for countless generations. Kofi's wife, Ama, was known for her garden. She grew vegetables that nourished not only their family, but were also bartered for other goods. She had the kind of grace that came from knowing one's place in the world and finding contentment in family, work, and community. Their home, while modest, was built with care. Palm fronds created shade where Kofi and Ama would sit in the evenings and discuss the day. The walls were decorated with symbols that represented their family's history, their connection to the land, their faith in forces larger than themselves. The village itself was governed by a council of elders, including Kofi. Disputes were settled with wisdom. Trade was conducted with fairness. The arrival of European ships had occurred intermittently over previous decades, but in recent years, these visits had become more frequent and more aggressive. Initially, the trade had been simple: European goods for local products, conducted with mutual respect. But the hunger for human beings as property had grown exponentially, and the nature of these transactions had become darker, more deceptive, more violent. In the year 1787, on a day that began like any other, Kofi traveled inland to attend a council meeting in a neighboring region. He was respected enough that his presence was requested for an important discussion about new trading agreements. Ama prepared him food for his journey. His eldest son helped ready his belongings. His youngest watched from the doorway, not yet understanding that this departure would be different from others. 3 days into his journey, as Kofi traveled through dense forest with 2 companions, they encountered what appeared to be a royal hunting party. In reality, it was a coordinated raid carried out by coastal traders who had paid local intermediaries for assistance. What happened next was the shattering moment when centuries of relative stability, shattered like pottery, dropped from a great height. Kofi and his companions were surrounded. Resistance meant immediate violence. Within minutes, they were captured, their hands bound with rope that cut into their wrists, their freedom transformed from something they took for granted into something they were forced to comprehend as being stolen. The journey to the coast took days. Kofi traveled in darkness, literally and psychologically. He was separated from the two men who had traveled with him. He was confined in spaces barely large enough to lie down. He was given minimal food and water. His mind reeled with incomprehension. How could this be happening? What transgression had brought this upon him? Would he ever see Amma again? Would his son continue the craft? Would his daughter wait, or would she be told he had abandoned his family? Other captives surrounded him in the darkness. Each told their own story of sudden loss, impossible trauma, brutal separation. An old woman who had been gathering firewood, a young man who had been hunting, a child who had been playing near the shore, a mother who had been purchasing vegetables at market, human beings suddenly reduced to inventory, suddenly existing only as potential profit for those who held them captive. The coastal fortress where Kofi was eventually held was a place designed specifically for the dehumanization of human beings. It was called a trading post, but it functioned as a concentration camp. The dungeons were beneath the fortress, accessed by stone steps that descended into perpetual darkness. The air was thick with the smell of human waste, disease, and despair. Chains connected people to walls and to each other. The heat in these spaces was unbearable. Dysentery spread rapidly. People died and their bodies remained for days until finally being removed. Kofi existed in this dungeon for 17 days. He witnessed suffering so profound that his mind sometimes refused to process it. He watched people lose hope. He watched a mother separated from her nursing infant. He witnessed an older man beaten brutally for attempting to comfort someone weeping. He endured hunger and thirst that made his body feel like it was consuming itself. And yet, in these chambers of hell, there were small moments of humanity. A woman who passed her portion of water to someone who was worse off. A man who whispered prayers in languages that connected people through shared faith. Hands that reached out in darkness to confirm that others still lived. The European traders who controlled the fortress conducted inspections where captives were examined like livestock. Teeth were inspected to determine age and health. Bodies were examined for signs of disease. People were made to jump, run, and demonstrate physical capability. It was the ultimate objectification, the complete stripping away of human dignity, all conducted with the clinical detachment of business professionals examining merchandise. One morning, Kofi and a group of other captives were removed from the dungeon. They were washed with salt water that stung every wound and sore on their bodies. They were given oil to rub on their skin to make them appear healthier and more marketable. Their hair was braided. They were dressed in loincloths. They were being prepared for sale, the next transaction in the process that would erase their former identities entirely. As they were led to the shore where a massive ship waited, anchored in the harbor like a harbinger of doom, Kofi caught his first glimpse of the Atlantic Ocean. He had never seen it before. It was vast and terrible and beautiful in a way that made his chest tighten with something between wonder and absolute horror. This ocean separated him forever from everything he had known. Behind him was his entire existence. Before him was an abyss of absolute uncertainty. The ship was called the Aurora. It would carry 643 human beings across the ocean. Many would not survive the journey, but on that day, as Kofi was forced up the wooden plank and below deck, none of them yet understood the full magnitude of what they would endure. The mechanics of slavery were not born from passion or impulse. They were created, refined, and perpetuated through careful financial calculation. To understand the true horror of what happened to Kofi and millions like him, one must understand the economics that made their suffering profitable. The slave trade was fundamentally a business enterprise. It required capital investment, logistics, market analysis, and sophisticated financial instruments. European merchants, African intermediaries, ship captains, colonial administrators, and merchants in the Americas formed an interconnected network of profit-seeking individuals bound together by one singular objective: maximum return on investment in human trafficking. The price Kofi would fetch on the auction block was determined by multiple factors: his age, his physical strength, his apparent health, his skill level, and his capacity to perform labor for decades. A prime male worker in his prime years could sell for between 60 and 90 pounds sterling in the 1780s. This might not sound like an extraordinary sum by modern standards, but in that era, it represented significant wealth. A skilled craftsman like Kofi, with documented abilities and demonstrable strength, would command a premium price. His knowledge of toolmaking and leatherwork made him valuable. His resistance to the psychological trauma, his refusal to become entirely broken, meant he retained the physical capability that enslaved people who had lost hope often lacked. The ship Aurora itself represented an extraordinary financial instrument. Built specifically for the slave trade, it cost approximately 4,000 pounds sterling to construct. This investment required returns. The ship's owners had to recover the construction cost while maintaining profitability. Every human being packed into its hold represented a unit of profit. The more units the ship could transport, the greater the potential return. The captain of the Aurora was a man named William Hartwick. He was not a sadist or a particularly cruel individual by the standards of his era. He was, by all historical accounts, a businessman conducting business. He held contracts that specified he would deliver a certain number of goods in a particular condition. Conditions too deteriorated, and the goods became unsaleable. Conditions too good, and the owners questioned his cost management. It was a macabre calculus where suffering was calibrated against profit margins. Hartwick kept meticulous records. In his ledgers, human beings appeared as line items. Male, 50 years, carpenter's skills, good teeth, no visible infection, estimated value £85. That was Kofi. His entire being, his lifetime of accumulated knowledge and experience, was reduced to this notation. He had been assigned a number, 347 in the manifest. He was no longer Kofi. He was a unit of cargo, a commodity in transit, a profit margin waiting to be realized. The conditions aboard the Aurora reflected the economic calculus of the slave trade. Enslaved people were packed so tightly that they could not sit upright. They lay in darkness, their bodies pressed against one another, surrounded by their own waste, suffering from diseases that spread with terrifying speed. This horrific overcrowding was not a bug in the system, but a feature. It represented maximized capacity at minimized cost. Providing better conditions would require larger ships, which would require greater capital investment. The difference in cost between maintaining slightly better conditions and accepting higher mortality rates was precisely calculated. If the mortality rate remained below a certain percentage, the trade remained profitable, even accounting for the loss of human life. Food aboard the ship consisted of rice, beans, and salt pork of the lowest quality. Water was rationed strictly. The logic was simple: keep the captives alive, but not comfortable. Provide enough nutrition to preserve capacity for labor, but not enough to allow them to regain strength. Diseases flourished in these conditions. Dysentery was constant, scurvy affected many. Respiratory infections spread through the hold like invisible assassins. The enslaved people were brought on deck twice daily, not out of humanitarian concern, but because exercise prevented them from deteriorating so rapidly that they became unmarketable upon arrival. During these brief moments in sunlight, they were forced to dance, to move, to simulate health and vitality. Those who were too weak to move were beaten. Those who attempted to resist or speak were punished. It was theatre performed for the benefit of those who would eventually purchase them. The enslaved people were learning the terrible truth that they must now perform health, simulate contentment, and hide their devastation or face even worse brutality. Kofi was beaten 3 times during the voyage. The first time was because he refused to dance, his spirit broken to the point where he could not perform the expected compliance. The overseer responsible interpreted this as defiance and administered 20 lashes with a whip. The second beating came weeks later when Kofi's wounds had barely begun to heal. Another enslaved man near him had attempted to resist, and in the brutal logic of the ship, collective punishment was administered. Everyone in a certain section received lashes. Kofi suffered for another man's desperate act of resistance. The third beating came just days before land was sighted, for no reason that Kofi could determine, except that the overseer was bored and wanted to inflict pain. The voyage lasted 56 days. During that time, 23 people died on the Aurora. Their bodies were weighted and thrown overboard. No ceremony, no moment of remembrance. They were simply disposed of like garbage. Some died from disease, some from wounds inflicted by the overseers, some from the psychological weight of knowing their former lives had ended and their futures held only suffering. A young woman Kofi had seen regularly in the hold, perhaps 20 years old, with eyes that held fierce intelligence, died on the 48th day. He never learned her name. She was simply gone, her potential erased. Her suffering ended by death that likely seemed merciful compared to what awaited the survivors. The financial accounts of the voyage were maintained with precision. Every expense was recorded: the cost of food, the cost of the crew, the cost of rope and repairs, the cost of medical supplies, such as they were. Against these expenses were weighed the anticipated revenues. Given that the ship was carrying 643 enslaved people at the time it left the African coast, and that 23 had died, 620 would be delivered to the auction block in the New World. At an average value of approximately £75 per person, the total revenue would be approximately £46,500 sterling. The ship's construction costs would be recovered in a single voyage. Everything after that was profit. But the economics extended far beyond the individual voyage. Slave traders in Liverpool, Bristol, and London developed complex financial networks. Insurance companies insured the cargo, calculating mortality rates and charging accordingly. Brokers arranged financing for plantation owners to purchase enslaved people. Banks provided credit. Investors who never went to sea, who never saw an enslaved person, accumulated wealth through stock holdings in slave trading companies. The system was sophisticated, interconnected, and deeply embedded in the financial structures of European commerce. Colonial planters in Jamaica, Barbados, Saint-Domingue, and the American colonies generated enormous wealth through the labor of enslaved people. A sugar plantation worked by enslaved people could generate returns of 15 to 20% annually. This wealth flowed back to Europe, enriching not just the plantation owners, but merchants, traders, shipbuilders, and financial institutions. Banks in cities like Amsterdam, Liverpool, and London had significant portions of their capital invested in slavery-related enterprises. The demand for enslaved people was insatiable. A sugar plantation that worked enslaved people to death, which happened routinely, would require a constant influx of replacements. The economic logic was perverse but clear. It was cheaper to work enslaved people to death and purchase replacements than it was to keep them alive long enough to have natural children. Enslaved women, therefore, existed in even more precarious circumstances. They endured all the brutality of male enslaved people while also facing systematic sexual violence that was embedded in the system itself. The psychological brutality was perhaps even more effective than the physical brutality. Kofi and the others were taught that their former lives, their families, their skills, and their dignity had no value in this new system. Everything they had been was irrelevant. Everything they could become was determined by their enslaver. The logic was circular and inescapable. You are enslaved because you are incapable of freedom. You will remain enslaved because you were born into this condition. Your children will be enslaved because they are your children. Resistance is futile. Escape is impossible. Hope is a luxury you cannot afford. And yet, from the beginning, there was resistance. On the Aurora, there were 2 attempted uprisings. The first was quickly suppressed, and those involved were executed as examples. The second was averted when the captain learned of it before it could be executed. The ringleaders were severely punished, flogged so brutally that one died from his wounds. But the fact of resistance, the fact that even in conditions of absolute domination, people attempted to reclaim their autonomy, speaks to something essential about human nature. Even when the system declared them property, even when every mechanism of society told them they were less than human, they resisted. They refused to accept their reduction to commodity. When land was finally sighted and the Aurora approached the coast of Jamaica, a new phase of the commerce in human beings began. The ship would be cleaned hastily. The enslaved people would be groomed to present their best appearance. The auction would be conducted with the formality of any commercial transaction. Men would bid against one another. Families would be separated without hesitation. The prices would be recorded in ledgers. And the enslaved would be dispersed to plantations across the island to begin the next phase of their suffering, the decades of uncompensated labor that would build the fortunes of the new world. The plantation where Kofi was sold was called Riverstone. It covered approximately 2,000 acres of Jamaican landscape. It was situated in a valley where constant moisture kept the sugarcane growing year-round. The main house was the imposing structure of stone and wood, elevated on pillars to allow air circulation. It featured multiple rooms, high ceilings, and wide verandas, where the plantation owner, a man named Edward Rutherford, and his family could survey their empire and the labor that created their wealth. Separated from the main house by perhaps a quarter-mile was the works, the factory where raw sugarcane was crushed, boiled, and converted into marketable sugar and molasses. This facility operated continuously, especially during crop season. The heat from the furnaces, combined with the humidity of Jamaica, created an infernal environment. People working in the works could expect severe burns, crushed limbs, and respiratory damage from the constant exposure to heat and smoke. Beyond the works were the fields where sugarcane grew in dense rows. And beyond the fields were the slave quarters, rows of simple structures built from wood and palm thatch, often no more than 12 by 15 feet in dimension. Multiple people were crammed into each structure. There was minimal furniture, no windows other than openings in the walls, and no privacy whatsoever. Kofi was assigned to skilled labor. His carpentry and leather-working abilities had been noted at the auction, and the overseer decided that his talents could be better utilized maintaining equipment rather than working the fields. This was not kindness, it was economic calculation. Skilled enslaved workers had value. They could be damaged through brutal field labor, but their skills could be utilized in ways that generated greater returns. Kofi was given a small workshop where he repaired and created tools. He crafted ox yokes, fashioned handles for implements, and maintained the wooden parts of machinery. But even skilled work carried its own burdens. Kofi was responsible for completing work according to schedules. Failure to meet expectations resulted in punishment, and the realities of existence under slavery meant that even those with somewhat less physically destructive work existed under constant surveillance, constant threat, and constant psychological pressure. The daily rhythm of life at Riverstone was determined entirely by the needs of sugar production. Bell ringing would wake the enslaved at 4 in the morning. By 5, they were expected to be in the fields. Work continued until midday, when a brief break allowed for minimal food. Work resumed and continued until dusk. The workday was typically 12 to 14 hours of unrelenting labor. Sundays were often reserved for worship, which the plantation owner deemed acceptable because it reduced the likelihood of uprising. But enslaved people understood something deeper about Sunday gatherings. It was one of the few times they could gather without constant supervision, and they used these gatherings to maintain connections, to share information, and to preserve their humanity through spiritual practices rooted in African traditions mixed with Christianity. Kofi's existence at Riverstone exemplifies a central contradiction of slavery, the complete devaluation of human beings, combined with utter dependency on their capabilities and labor. The enslaved were treated as less than human, and yet the entire system rested entirely on their willingness or coercion to work. This paradox created constant tension. How could the enslaved be understood as naturally suited for slavery when so much force was required to maintain it? How could they be understood as inferior when their labor generated the wealth of empires? Other enslaved people at Riverstone became Kofi's closest human connections. There was Thomas, who worked in the fields and had been enslaved for over a decade. Thomas bore the physical marks of plantation labor, severe scars on his back from whipping, fingers missing from an accident with machinery, a permanent limp from a broken leg that had never been properly set. Yet Thomas possessed a kind of fierce wisdom. He spoke with others at night, helping them understand that their enslavement was not a reflection of their nature, but rather a function of violence and economics. There was a woman named Zara who worked in the plantation household. She had learned to navigate the complex politics of the big house, and she could sometimes obtain food, supplies, or information that made others' lives marginally less difficult. Zara also carried the weight of sexual exploitation. The plantation owner and his male relatives felt entitled to her body and the bodies of other women enslaved at the plantation. She endured this with the stoicism of someone who understood that resistance meant worse violence, but she also maintained agency in small ways, small acts of defiance, moments where she withheld cooperation or undermined the plantation owner's will in subtle ways. There was Isaac, who was 7 years old at Riverstone. He had been born into slavery. This was enormously significant. Isaac would never know freedom except as an idea, a concept his parents tried to convey to him in whispered conversations. But slavery was his entire reality. He played with other children in the slave quarters, learning the rules of survival from other children. He watched his parents and older relatives with a mixture of love and incomprehension of why their faces carried such pain. Food at Riverstone was minimal. Each enslaved person received weekly rations consisting of salted corn, beans, and occasional portions of fish or meat. The rations were calculated to provide minimal nutrition, enough to sustain labor, but not enough for health or vitality. Many enslaved people engaged in small-scale cultivation of gardens, if they were permitted time to do so, growing vegetables and raising chickens to supplement their diet. These gardens were sometimes tolerated because they slightly reduced the food costs to the plantation owner, but they also represented crucial moments of autonomy and resistance, growing food for oneself rather than entirely depending on the meager supplies provided by the enslaver. Medical care at the plantation was minimal. There was no actual doctor. The plantation owner was supposed to provide care, and he employed a person who had no formal training but claimed experience with herbal remedies. This person was thoroughly incompetent for actual medical situations. People who were injured or became ill often received no care and died or recovered depending on chance. Pregnant women received no special care. Childbirth was a dangerous ordeal. Infant mortality was extraordinarily high. Kofi existed in this world for 7 years. During that time, he established a network of relationships that provided meaning in circumstances designed to erase meaning entirely. He maintained his dignity through small acts of daily resistance, maintaining his independence of thought, refusing to accept the enslaver's characterization of him as subhuman, maintaining connections with other enslaved people, preserving memories of his former life. But the psychological toll accumulated. Kofi would sometimes stand at the edge of his workshop and think of Amma and his children. He had no way of knowing whether they lived or died. He had no way of sending messages. For all he knew, they had forgotten him, or perhaps they believed he had abandoned them. The uncertainty was itself a form of torture. The life of enslaved people was also shaped by the constant threat of sale. At any moment, an enslaved person could be sold away from established connections, sold away from family members, dispersed to a different plantation. This ever-present possibility of separation prevented the formation of stable families and communities. It also created a form of psychological terrorism, the knowledge that any relationship could be severed instantly by economic calculation. Religion played a complex role in this landscape. The plantation owner permitted Christian worship because he believed it made enslaved people more docile and encouraged acceptance of suffering as part of divine will. He did not understand that enslaved people were interpreting Christianity in completely different ways. To them, the Christian story of liberation, of a people freed from bondage, of resurrection and redemption, spoke directly to their own circumstances. They were creating a form of spirituality that maintained hope and preserved identity. In the evenings, in the slave quarters after work had ended, there would be moments of music. People would sing in languages their enslavers did not understand. Languages brought from Africa, languages created through the mixing of African and European words. The songs carried stories, coded messages, historical memory, and expressions of sorrow and joy that could not be expressed through any other means. Kofi participated in these moments of community. He listened to stories from people who had been enslaved in different places. He learned about organized resistance, about places where enslaved people had successfully rebelled, about Haiti, where a revolution had created a free black nation. These stories circulated through the slave quarters, passed hand to hand, mouth to mouth, giving people a sense that their situation, though seemingly permanent, was in fact not inevitable. There was a man named Samuel who came to the plantation when Kofi had been there for approximately 5 years. Samuel had escaped from slavery on a nearby plantation and had lived in the mountains for 2 years, part of a community of Maroons, formerly enslaved people who had escaped and formed their own free settlements. Samuel had been captured and returned to slavery, and he now bore the physical evidence of the punishment for his escape attempt. He had been brutally whipped, but his presence also conveyed something else. That escape was possible, that people had successfully built free lives outside the plantation system, that resistance could take forms beyond individual defiance. The plantation economy of Jamaica in the late 18th century was built entirely on this system of enslaved labor. The island produced extraordinary wealth. The sugar was sold globally, enriching merchants and traders, being consumed by people across Europe and beyond. These consumers, most of them, never thought about the hands that had planted, harvested, and processed their sugar. They never considered the lives that were destroyed to produce their sweetness. They simply enjoyed the product of this brutality, but the system was beginning to face pressure. Enlightenment philosophy was beginning to question slavery's morality. Religious movements were beginning to oppose it, and the enslaved themselves were beginning to resist more openly. In 1791, just as Kofi's 7 years of existence at Riverstone were coming to a close, something would occur that would reshape everything. The revolution in Saint-Domingue, which began in August of 1791, sent shockwaves through the Caribbean. The enslaved people of that island, numbering nearly 500,000, had risen up against their enslavers. What had begun as local rebellions had evolved into a massive coordinated uprising that would eventually result in the complete overthrow of slavery on the island and the establishment of Haiti, the first black republic in the world. News traveled quickly through the slave quarters of Jamaica, despite the efforts of plantation owners to suppress it. Encoded in songs, whispered in conversations, circulated through maroon communities that maintained connections with enslaved people on plantations, the message was clear. Slavery was not forever. It could be resisted. It could be overthrown. At Riverstone, the plantation owner, Edward Rutherford, responded with increased security measures. Overseers were armed more heavily. Passes were required for enslaved people to move beyond the immediate plantation. Gatherings were more strictly supervised. The threat of violent punishment for any hint of rebellion was constantly reinforced. But something fundamental had shifted in the consciousness of enslaved people across Jamaica. The possibility of freedom had moved from theoretical to actual. If enslaved people on one island could successfully rebel, why not on Jamaica? Samuel, the escaped Maroon who had been returned to slavery, became instrumental in organizing a resistance movement at Riverstone. He was not the only organizer. There were others throughout Jamaica who were coordinating efforts, planning for an island-wide uprising. The plan that began to circulate was for a massive rebellion that would occur across multiple plantations simultaneously, overwhelming the ability of enslavers and their militias to respond. Kofi, now in his early 60s, was drawn into these discussions. At first he resisted. He was older. He had physical limitations. The likelihood of successful rebellion seemed small. But as he listened to others discuss plans, as he considered what another 20 years of slavery would mean, he made a choice. He would join the resistance. The planning occurred in secrecy. Signals were developed. Certain songs meant specific things. Coded language allowed people to discuss plans without alerting overseers. Maps were mentally constructed by people who had worked different parts of the plantation. An understanding of which enslaved people would fight, which could be defended, and how to overcome the military advantages of the enslavers began to form. The date selected for the rebellion at Riverstone was November 15th, 1792. The plan was coordinated with rebellions planned at other plantations. If all proceeded as intended, hundreds of enslaved people would rise up simultaneously across the island. The night before the rebellion, Kofi could not sleep. He was 70 years old. He had endured slavery for 7 years. He would likely die in the coming conflict, but the prospect of at least attempting to reclaim his freedom, of dying as a free person rather than continuing to die slowly as an enslaved person, felt like the only meaningful choice remaining to him. The rebellion began at dawn. Men and women who had endured decades of brutality emerged with machetes, spears, and a few firearms they had managed to acquire or construct. They moved first against the works, destroying the machinery that converted their labor into sugar. They burned the cane fields. They began moving toward the big house. The plantation owner, Edward Rutherford, had been alerted to danger. He fled, as most enslavers did when facing uprising. He headed toward the coast where he could board a ship and escape to another island. But many of the overseer and the hired militia remained to defend the plantation. The confrontation was brief and brutal. The enslaved people, despite their lack of military training, had the advantages of knowledge of the landscape and desperate motivation. They also had numbers. Where the enslavers had military weapons, the enslaved had overwhelming force. When it ended, 5 of the militia had been killed, several others had been wounded and fled. The big house was set on fire, But the rebellion on Jamaica was not succeeding as the organizers had hoped. Coordinated uprisings at some plantations had been suppressed. A major rebellion in the western part of the island was being fought to a standstill. The colonial militia was reorganizing and responding with overwhelming force. By December, the major coordinated rebellions had been crushed. Kofi and approximately 300 formerly enslaved people from Riverstone and surrounding plantations had fled to the mountains. There they encountered established Maroon communities, settlements of formerly enslaved people and their children who had successfully escaped years earlier and had created autonomous communities in the mountainous interior of Jamaica. For several months, Kofi lived in a Maroon settlement. It was the first time since his capture that he had experienced anything resembling freedom. He lived in a community where decisions were made collectively. He worked when work needed to be done, but he worked for the community's benefit, not for an enslaver's profit. He was treated with respect as an elder. He shared stories of his former life, his family, his craft. Others shared their own stories of escape, resistance, and community building. But the colonial authorities were determined to destroy the Maroon settlements. Military expeditions were launched. The Maroons, despite their knowledge of the terrain and their fierce resistance, were increasingly pressed. Faced with impossible odds and the prospect of total destruction, the Maroon leadership negotiated a treaty with the colonial authorities. The treaty allowed the Maroons to remain in their settlements under the condition that they would not harbor escaped enslaved people and would assist in capturing runaways. Kofi understood that the negotiated agreement was a kind of betrayal, but it was also a pragmatic survival strategy. The Maroons could not defeat the colonial military. They could only buy themselves survival by agreeing to these conditions. It was another example of the way the system of slavery corrupted everything it touched, creating situations where even free people of color and formerly enslaved people found themselves forced to participate in the system's perpetuation. The Maroon leadership offered Kofi and others a choice. They could leave the mountains and return to the possibility of slavery or sale, or they could remain in the settlement under the new arrangements. Some chose to leave. Some chose to stay. Kofi chose to stay. For the remainder of his life, Kofi lived in a Maroon settlement. He was not enslaved, but he was also not free in any absolute sense. He was constrained by the treaty arrangements, by his age, by the limitations of living in a mountainous settlement with limited resources. But he maintained his dignity. He was treated as a person. He was not enslaved. From the Maroon settlement, Kofi received information about other resistance movements. The rebellion of Toussaint Louverture in Saint-Domingue continued to expand. A free black republic had been established. The possibility of freedom for black people, once theoretical, was becoming real in parts of the Caribbean. Kofi lived for another 22 years in the Maroon settlement. He died in 1814 at approximately 92 years old. By most historical standards, he lived to an extraordinary age. He lived long enough to see the contradictions of slavery becoming undeniable to the wider world. He lived long enough to know that his resistance and the resistance of countless others had altered the trajectory of history. But Kofi was only one person. There were millions. Samuel, the Maroon warrior, executed in 1796 when he was captured during another rebellion attempt. Zara, the woman who had endured sexual violence while maintaining her agency, sold to another plantation and lost to history's record. Thomas, the field worker whose wisdom had sustained others, died of illness in 1794, never knowing freedom. Isaac, the child born into slavery, he lived to see slavery abolished in the British Caribbean in 1834, at age 53. He was among the first generation to experience both slavery and freedom. The resistance of enslaved people took many forms. Large-scale rebellions like those in Jamaica and Saint-Domingue received historical attention. But there was also daily resistance. People working more slowly than they could, damaging property, feigning illness, running away temporarily to the mountains and returning, teaching children to question rather than accept their enslavement. There was resistance through maintaining cultural practices, the languages, music, spiritual beliefs, and family structures that enslavers attempted to destroy. There was resistance through forming new communities, establishing new families, despite the system's intention to prevent stable relationships. The psychological resistance was perhaps most remarkable. Despite living in conditions designed to make them believe themselves inferior and incapable of freedom, enslaved people maintained a sense of their own worth. They told stories of freedom, they sang of liberation. They taught their children that their enslavement was not a reflection of their nature, but rather a function of violence inflicted upon them. They maintained hope against overwhelming odds. The abolition of slavery in the British Caribbean came in 1833, approximately 41 years after Kofi's rebellion at Riverstone. It came not through the benevolence of enslavers or the enlightenment of colonial governments, but through decades of organized abolition campaigns in Britain and the relentless resistance of enslaved people themselves. Yet abolition, the legal declaration that slavery would no longer exist, was not liberation. The conditions under which enslaved people transitioned to freedom were designed to maximize the continued exploitation of their labor. Former enslaved people were required to work as apprentices under their former enslavers for up to 6 years with minimal compensation. They were forced into economic arrangements that kept them perpetually in debt. They were excluded from political participation. They faced violence and social ostracization. The wealth generated through centuries of slave labor was not reparated to those who had generated it through centuries of unpaid work. The plantation owners, the people who had grown wealthy through slavery, received compensation from the British government. They were paid for the loss of their property. The enslaved received nothing. They began their freedom with nothing but the clothes on their backs and were immediately forced into economic systems designed to recreate the conditions of slavery under different legal arrangements. Kofi never received reparation for the 7 years of labor stolen from him, for the separation from his family, for the psychological torment of enslavement. No one paid him for his carpentry work that had enriched Edward Rutherford. No one compensated him for the scars on his back from beatings. He died poor, leaving nothing of material value to his descendants. Yet Kofi's story, and the stories of millions like him, shaped the world that emerged after slavery. The Caribbean islands, where enslaved people had rebelled most successfully, Haiti, Jamaica, parts of other islands, became places where free black people, while still facing discrimination and poverty, had the possibility of agency that slavery had denied them. The success of these resistance movements influenced the consciousness of people in Africa, in the Americas, and in Europe. They demonstrated that slavery, for all its elaborate systems of domination and violence, was not natural or inevitable. It could be resisted. It could be overthrown. The intellectual work of understanding what slavery meant and why it was wrong accelerated in the 19th century. Formerly enslaved people who had learned to read and write, sometimes secretly, sometimes through the generosity of those who opposed slavery, began writing their own accounts. Frederick Douglass, Harriet Jacobs, Solomon Northup and countless others told their stories in ways that made the horrors of slavery impossible for literate audiences to ignore. These accounts gave voice to experiences that slavery had attempted to erase. The economic legacy of slavery continued to shape the world for centuries. The wealth generated through slavery did not disappear. It was invested in businesses, real estate, financial institutions. The fortunes of cities like Liverpool, Bristol, and London were built substantially through involvement in the slave trade. The wealth of families in Britain and Europe accumulated through slavery was passed to descendants who used it to secure positions of social and economic power. Meanwhile, the descendants of the enslaved faced systematic exclusion, violence, and discrimination designed to perpetuate the subordination that slavery had created. The moral legacy was also complex. The system of slavery, justified by ideologies of racial hierarchy, created racial categories in ways that had not existed before. The idea that humanity could be divided into racial groups with innate differences in capability and worth was developed, promoted, and seemingly validated by the system of slavery. After slavery was abolished, these racial ideologies persisted, creating justifications for continued subjugation of people of African descent through colonialism, segregation, and discrimination. And yet, the resistance of enslaved people created another legacy. The knowledge that human beings could not be completely broken, that dignity persisted even in conditions designed to destroy it, that freedom was not something that could be permanently stolen because the human desire for it was fundamental. This knowledge circulated through communities of color across the Americas and in Africa. It influenced the consciousness of people fighting for freedom and dignity in the 20th century. In the Caribbean, the descendants of enslaved people who had successfully rebelled, particularly in Haiti, became symbols of possibility. A formerly enslaved people had built a republic, a democracy, a functioning society. They had demonstrated that the dehumanization attempted through slavery could not be completely successful, that knowledge and capability had persisted, that freedom was achievable. Today, more than 3 centuries after Kofi was captured, and more than 2 centuries after slavery was abolished in the British Caribbean, the legacy of that system remains visible. The islands of the Caribbean, still among the poorest in the world despite their extraordinary natural resources, demonstrate the long-term consequences of slavery and the subsequent systems of exploitation designed to replace it. The wealth extracted from these islands through slavery was not returned. The infrastructure of education and development was not built. The political autonomy that had been denied for centuries continued to be restricted even after nominal independence was granted. What would Kofi's life have been if he had not been captured? If his family had not been separated? If the skill he had developed over a lifetime had not been stolen? We can only imagine he would have lived in freedom, with dignity, with his family intact. He would have practiced his craft for his own benefit and the benefit of his community. He would have lived and died surrounded by people he loved, having achieved what he himself determined to be important. Instead, he lived in captivity. He was separated from everything he had known. His labor enriched people he never knew and would never know. His suffering was rendered quotidian, absorbed into the ordinary operations of a system designed to erase his humanity. But he also resisted. He maintained his dignity. He eventually participated in rebellion against slavery. He lived to freedom, however constrained. He became an elder in a maroon settlement, respected and honored. Kofi's story is not unique. It is the story of millions. In the Atlantic world, approximately 12 million African people were transported across the ocean through the slave trade. Of those, approximately 2 million died during the journey across the Atlantic. Millions more died under slavery. Their stories were not recorded. Their families were destroyed. Their labor was stolen. Their lives were reduced to commodity values in ledgers now housed in archives. But their names and their stories are beginning to be recovered. Historians, descendants, and advocates are working to restore names and narratives to the people whose humanity was denied. The process is slow, often incomplete, constrained by the incomplete historical record that slavery created. Yet the effort itself represents a form of resistance to the project of slavery, the project of making these people disappear, of reducing them to statistical abstractions, of erasing them from human history. What does it mean to remember these stories today, in a world that still bears the marks of slavery, in racial hierarchies, in economic inequality, in the continued subjugation of people of African descent? Remembering becomes an act of resistance and justice. Remembering Kofi, remembering the millions like him, refusing the comfortable amnesia that slavery requires, insisting that their suffering be acknowledged and that their dignity be affirmed, this becomes a political act. The reparation that was not given during slavery or during the immediate aftermath of abolition remains a moral question today. What reparations are due to the descendants of the enslaved? What reconstruction of societies devastated by slavery is required to create any semblance of justice? These are questions that remain contested and unresolved. But Kofi's life and the lives of millions like him make clear that the system of slavery was not simply a matter of individual cruelty or moral failing. It was a comprehensive system that organized societies around the extraction of value from enslaved people. It required legal systems, economic systems, military systems, and ideological systems to function. It created wealth for some by absolutely impoverishing others. It created hierarchies that persisted long after slavery itself was abolished. Understanding slavery as a system, not simply as a historical tragedy, allows us to see how its logic continues to shape the world. Kofi's capture and enslavement occurred not because of anything inherent to him or his people, but because of a system designed to extract value from African people specifically. That system has ended in its formal legal sense, but the world that slavery created, the racial hierarchies, the wealth disparities, the political inequalities, continues to structure reality. What would true reparation mean? It would mean the restoration of dignity to people whose humanity was denied. It would mean the redistribution of wealth extracted through slavery to the descendants of those from whom it was stolen. It would mean the construction of societies and systems that affirm rather than deny the fundamental equality and worth of people of African descent. It would mean the transformation of the systems of power that slavery created. And it would mean remembrance. Kofi deserves to be remembered not as a commodity, not as a statistic, but as a human being of dignity, of capability, of courage. He deserves to be remembered as an elder who participated in rebellion against an unjust system. He deserves to be remembered as a man who survived and who, in surviving, resisted. Every one of the millions who endured slavery deserves this remembrance. Not as victims without agency, but as people who resisted, who maintained dignity, who created meaning and community, even in circumstances designed to deny meaning and community. The children born to the enslaved, the families formed against all odds, the rebellions organized and conducted. These represent human capability and human will, even under the most extreme circumstances. Kofi died in 1814. The world he entered into freedom, however constrained, was shaped by the rebellion he participated in and the rebellions of millions like him. Haiti had become a free black nation. Jamaica was beginning to experience the cracks in the system of slavery that would eventually lead to abolition. The consciousness of people across the Atlantic was beginning to shift. The absolute dominance of slavery was beginning to waver. This was Kofi's contribution. Not through great historical recognition, few would ever know his name, but through his refusal to be completely broken, through his participation in rebellion, through his survival into freedom, through the example of human dignity in the face of dehumanization. This is his legacy. This is the legacy of millions like him. Their names may be forgotten, but the impact of their resistance echoes through history. Every freedom won by people of African descent, every moment of dignity asserted, every rebellion against injustice stands on the foundation that they created through their resistance. Kofi is dead, but his legacy lives. His story lives, his resistance lives. And as long as we continue to tell these stories, to remember these lives, to insist on the recognition of human dignity, even in systems designed to deny it, Kofi lives. What aspects of this story moved you most profoundly? What do you think would you have done in Kofi's position? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your reflections matter. They keep these stories alive. They honor the memory of millions whose names have been lost, but whose stories deserve to be remembered.